Now, continuing how proper names really work. This can explain rigidity. Of course, not all users of the name will know its identifying role. Indeed, people may use the name Aristotle knowing only auxiliary descriptions like the teacher of Alexander, the master of those who know, the philosopher mentioned by the professor, or indefinite descriptions like a Greek philosopher, or even wrong descriptions, wrong but convergent, like a Greek general. But there must be privileged users who know this rule at least partially, and people who use the name without knowing what they are saying must rely on the knowledge of these privileged users. Without this, the reference simply collapses. With the adoption of this role of identification, it's easy to see that the meaning as cognitive content, that is, the fregean sense, the informative Gehalt, the epistemische Wert of a proper name is nuclearly constituted by its localizing and characterizing description rules. Only secondarily, in its fringes, the content of meaning is enriched by the auxiliary description rules. Indeed, it is intuitive that Aristotle is much more necessarily the Greek philosopher who wrote the Aristotelian opus than the founder of the Lyceum or the lover of Herphiles, since those descriptions convey to us only very contingent accidental information. An important advantage of our rules of identification for proper names is that they allow us to explain rigidity within descriptivism. For Kripke, a rigid designator is the same as a designator that refers to the same object in all possible worlds where this object exists. This is the case of proper names. So the name Aristotle refers to the same object in all possible worlds where this object, Aristotle, exists. But definite descriptions are different. They are flaccid designators, defined as those that refer to different objects in different possible worlds. For example, the lover of Herphiles. In our world, this man is Aristotle, but in a different possible world can be his friend Theophrastus or no person at all if Herphiles didn't choose to have a lover, maybe. However, our rule of identification for proper names, differently from any detached description, is applicable in all possible worlds where Aristotle exists. This is the essential point to note. The application of the rule of identification for the proper name is simply the definitory criterion sufficient for the existence of the owner of the proper name. I use here the Wittgensteinian sense of criterion from the Blue Book, where a criterion is something that gives us, if it really is given, assurance of the existence of the object. We can make it clearer by putting the rule of identification in a descriptive form. Consider the following version of the rule. 1. Aristotle is the same as the man who satisfies sufficiently and more than any other the conditions of having born in Stagira in 384 BC, who lived part of his life in Athens and died in Chalkis in 322 BC, and or of being the author of the main ideas of the Aristotelian opus. The second term of this identity sentence is a rigid description for it is intuitively applicable in all possible worlds where Aristotle exists, and in no world where he does not exist. And the identity sentence 1 is analytic and necessarily true. Another great advantage of the proposed definition is that it can better explain why proper names are rigid while descriptions are flaccid. It's due to the so-called flexibility of the proper names. That Sully, for example, speak about this flexibility. It is simply because many descriptions are loosely linked with a proper name, so that this link can be easily dissolved in a different possible world. So, we think that Aristotle was the founder of the Lyceum in our world, but since no description is necessarily linked with the proper name, it can be that in a different world he let this work to be done by his friend Theophrastus, nevertheless remaining our Aristotle. This can be proved when considered that when you choose descriptions that have no proper name to be put in their place, and they are fundamental descriptions, especially when they are fundamental descriptions but not necessarily, they turn to be rigid. For example, the eastermost point of the South America, the 3rd Regiment of Cavalry from Sintra, the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1940, or the last Ice Age. These are rigid descriptions because we don't have a proper name to relate with them. Even in possible worlds where the place where situated the eastermost point of the South America were situated in a more oriental point, for example in the Earth of Fire, in a world where for example the men and the horses were orders, in the case of the 3rd Regiment of Cavalry from Sintra, in a world where the Archduke were poisoned or strangled, in the case of the assassination of the Austrian Archduke in 1940, in a world where the last Ice Age finished 100,000 years ago instead of 10,000 years ago, since these descriptions were not linked to any proper name, these descriptions will designate the same place, the same object, event and process in any possible world where these places, objects, events and processes exist.